Good evening, everyone. My name is Luis Lopez, and I'm an investigator with Westminster Police Department's Public Information Unit. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm going to be off camera, as is my partner, investigator Sherry Spotke. We're going to kind of be doing the tech side and the moderating of tonight's meeting. We will have a presentation this evening from Sergeant Matt Trinka and investigator Wayne Reed. They will be presenting on officer accountability, internal affairs investigations, and the disciplinary process. So the way this has been working for us with our last presentations is we will have our presentations, and which goes approximately 30 minutes. And at the end of that, then we will open it up to questions. In order to not interrupt the presenters, we ask that if you have any questions, please type them in. They will appear on my screen, and then I can ask them in the order that they were received. Additionally, in respect for your time as well as ours, we will go until 7 the latest, and then try to promptly stop at 7. If we do not get to your question, we will answer you later via email. So I think that pretty much covers it. Go ahead, Sergeant Trinka.
Wayne, you want to introduce yourself?
Hey guys, my name is Wayne Reed. I'm an investigator at the police department. I've been here since 1994. I've been doing this particular job for the last 20 years. And this being professional standards, which is backgrounds and internal affairs. And that's about it for me.
So my name is Sergeant Matt Trinka. I've been with the department since 1995. I'm currently in the role of the professional services unit, and we oversee the hiring and internal affairs. I've been doing this for the last 4 years. Prior to that, I do have some experience as an investigator some years ago doing internal affairs and background and hiring. So we'll go ahead and get started. Again, my current role as a professional services sergeant, we oversee the hiring and internal affairs. The topics we're going to be covering tonight, again, are officer accountability, internal affairs, are personnel investigations, and then the disciplinary process. So we'll start off just real briefly to kind of cover what we do as far as our primary responsibilities and professional services. So again, we hire all police department personnel, and that stems from our sworn side all the way over to our non-sworn side. So records, animal management, criminalists, equipment services, everything all the way up to sworn services. We do the hiring across the board. So that's our one main priority, and then our other main priority is internal affairs investigations or personnel investigations. And it's interesting, and Wayne did a class a couple weeks ago on the hiring, and why do these two things go together? And basically it's because of good hiring practices lead to better officer community relations. So if we hire good police officers, they go out and they do a good job, they interact well with the community. And so hiring quality individuals leads to less potential negative interactions with that community. So our role within the department, I think, is probably one of the most important parts, both for today and going into the future. So that's why we're in charge of those two units. So kind of going into the officer accountability, I think the first thing is we hear the word accountability quite a bit. The word gets thrown around quite a bit, and a lot of people talk about accountability, but I don't know if anybody's really looked up the word accountability in the dictionary to see what exactly that word means. And simply put, accountability is an obligation or willingness to accept responsibilities for one's actions. Accountability does not mean punishment. Again, it's the willingness to accept responsibility for our own actions. And here at Westminster, I think we do an exceptional job of being held accountable and having accountability for what we do. And one of the questions I'll pose to you now early on is, what does accountability look like? And I'll pose that question to you all, both for police officers and Westminster employees, as well as people out in the community. The bottom line is, when we, as a department, employee, when we mess up, simply put, we take full responsibility. And I think that kind of sums up what accountability is. As far as our process, when we do the hiring and personnel investigations, the accountability starts even before we hire people. And we look for people that we're going to hire that are good for the job, good for the community, and good overall. So we hire the best people for the job. And again, Wayne covered that a few weeks ago in the hiring practices. Accountability comes in many ways, shapes, or forms. It starts with having good practices. What are the best practices and policies that we can put forth? And that's accountability. We are continually evaluating how and what we do. And what does that look like? So every day we go out, I think we're very good, very proactive at looking in a mirror and seeing how can we do things better every day. And again, I think that goes back to accountability. So some of the things that we do is going out and soliciting critical feedback, any type of feedback from the community all the way down to peer-to-peer feedback. So after for instance, we're done with say a patrol call, officers will get together and they'll talk about how things went. Within that call, maybe we stay a few minutes or we contact people that are in the area. That's again soliciting feedback from the community. And so there's a lot of things that we do. We have our daily interactions, whether that be through just being out in the community, going to a Starbucks to get a coffee, going to McDonald's to grab a hamburger, or actually making a traffic stop on somebody. So our daily interactions with people never stop. And again, that's a key way to solicit that feedback that we're always looking for. Other things that we might do, the city council meetings. We try to attend the city council meetings, solicit feedback in those categories. We hold community meetings like we're doing right now. Try to get the community involved, find out what their concerns are, both positive and negative, and then give feedback back. Always looking for a way to improve our performance and how we go about doing our daily activities. We have websites, web pages, Facebook, and all the other things on there. We're always looking for feedback. And from our position in professional services, that's a key way to interact with people. It's also a key way to do recruitment. And I think Wayne touched on that a little bit on how we get our word out. So again, that we can hire those good quality people. Another way we solicit critical feedback and remain accountable to our citizens is through internal affairs investigations. That's probably one of our primary ways of checking ourselves. We'll go into that in a few minutes, but again, that's how we hold ourselves accountable. Every call, every situation we go on gives us an opportunity to evaluate ourselves. Every call, every traffic stop, and every contact an officer goes on can be an opportunity to learn and evaluate, and again, holding ourselves accountable. Certain things that we do, we have forms that we complete after every call that evaluate us. If we get into a pursuit with a vehicle, or we have a use of force report, those reports are completed and evaluated and shipped through the chain of command so that everybody within the department knows what's going on. It's a summary of the situation so people can get through that. They can evaluate it. Maybe there's some things that we can learn through every situation. One great thing about law enforcement is we go on a lot of similar calls, but no two calls are ever alike. And that's always an opportunity for us to learn. So again, we're constantly, things that we held ourselves accountable for is we train constantly as a department, whether it be report writing, whether it be arrest control, defensive tactics, driving, officer survival, or we're out at the range, in-service training, legal updates, that type of thing. We're constantly training and we're constantly trying to better ourselves. One thing I learned as a new officer, and one of the things that was instilled to me, was always be a student of the game. And this game is law enforcement. So again, we're constantly training, going to trainings, doing educational type things. This is a job that we can never stop learning. And I think as long as we're learning, that's a form of us holding ourselves accountable. The bottom line is we are humans. And as humans, we make mistakes. We're not robots. The key of that is it's how we evaluate those mistakes that makes us who we are. And by learning from those mistakes, holding ourselves accountable, continually evaluating what we do, again, is the accountability issues. And I'll touch on some numbers, just kind of some factual numbers to kind of give you an idea of what we deal with on a yearly basis. When I get into IAs, I'll touch on some numbers there in a minute. But one of the things that we do, and I'll touch again on the personnel investigations, is we handle what's called supervisory inquiries. And supervisory inquiries are basically complaints coming in from citizens who have had contact with police or don't like something that happened. And in 2020, just to give you an idea, we received 42 supervisory inquiries last year in 2020. So if I don't have the numbers today, and I apologize for that, but out of all the things that we do 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, we had 42 supervisory inquiries last year. Of those 42 supervisory inquiries, 12 were founded or resulted in some type of disciplinary action, and we'll cover that towards the end as far as disciplinary action. But I think overall, we're doing a great job. Can we always learn? Absolutely. So again, all these examples lead back to the accountability. And again, I'll stress that. It's the ability, desire, and willingness to accept responsibility for our own actions. And I think we here in Westminster do a fantastic job of doing that. Kind of breaking down some numbers to give you an idea of maybe police work across the country. In 2018, to give you an idea roughly, 53.5 million people were contacted by law enforcement. And again, that's out of 330 million people roughly in the United States. So roughly we can say 16% of the population is being contacted by law enforcement in some shape or form throughout the year. And that doesn't seem like a lot, but it's still quite a bit. Of those 53.5 million contacts, 99.7 resulted in absolutely no physical force. It was a traffic stop, it was a call for service of some type, a domestic, and that goes all the way down to the robberies, the real violent type crimes. But again, 99.7 of those from the DOJ statistics resulted in absolutely no physical force. Another number to kind of keep in context to this whole thing is there's roughly 11 million arrests each year made by law enforcement across the country. And that's about 800,000 cops from coast to coast. And of those 11 million arrests each year, 98.5 of those arrests happen and occur with no physical force. So I think that's a pretty good statistic. Breaking it down a little bit further, just to kind of give you an idea where Westminster is at. In 2020, we had roughly 3,100 arrests. It was 3,178 in 2020. Our stats were a little bit higher in 2020. I don't know if that's going to continue. I'll give you a number the last 3 years, but 2.62% of those arrests resulted in some type of documented use of force. Prior to 2020, over the last 3 years, 1.64 of all arrests resulted in a use of force deal. So again, looking at the accountability, a lot of people associate with that on interactions, and arrests are a good way to kind of paint a picture of those deals. And so that kind of gives you an idea in the overall complexity and how many people we're contacting in the year. Unfortunately, I did not have the numbers of how many contacts and calls for services we had last year, and I apologize for that. But on the next one, hopefully we have those. So when accountability comes to play, I talked about internal affairs investigations or personnel investigations. So I'm going to go into the next topic, which is internal investigations or personnel investigations. And a lot of people don't really understand what is an internal investigation or a personnel investigation. And you'll have to excuse me on this. I just kind of want to give you a little bit idea what our policies and procedures say. A personnel investigation arises out of a written or verbal statement alleging misconduct by an employee of the police department. They include all anonymous allegations of misconduct, as well as those received in person, by mail, or telephone. Personnel investigations protect employees from false allegations of misconduct. They protect the city from false allegations of misconduct, and they identify, and I think this is an important part, they identify departmental deficiencies and/or training needs, and they determine whether or not employees have engaged in misconduct. And again, basically, in professional services in the IA world, we're police of the police. Personnel investigations may be initiated externally by citizen complaints or other city departments or agencies. They may be generated internally by an employee or supervisor of the department or the result of an administrative review process. And I think one of the highlights of the policies is one of the main purposes of personnel investigations is to maintain integrity through appropriate investigations of alleged police misconduct. The bottom line is that's what we investigate. So when we talk about personnel or internal investigations, there's a series of steps that we go through, and we'll cover this, but we wanted to first talk about what generates or constitutes an IA. There's several factors that go into our IAs. And first and foremost is any criminal acts or alleged criminal acts that were supposedly done by an employee. Allegations of excessive force generates IAs. Allegations involving employees of 2 or more divisions. Allegations in the form of notice intent to sue, which is becoming more common quite a bit. Other allegations are allegations in which the deputy chief's judgment, would require considerable time to investigate or have resources or are in the best interest of the department to be investigated by professional services. So again, these are all things that constitute an internal affairs investigation. The last is in professional services section should be notified immediately and initiate investigation into allegations of grave misconduct or serious violations of the law on the part of the police department. So all these things you can see are checks and balances for the department that we investigate. Other things that we investigate are officer-involved shootings or critical incidences. And in a situation like that, to kind of go off tangent a little bit, when we have an officer-involved incident, an officer-involved shooting incident, or a critical incident, most times we call in a critical incident team, which consists of multiple outside agencies investigating the incident and then presenting that information to the DA's office. That in it by itself puts the investigation in somebody else's hands, so it doesn't look like we're always investigating our own people. And there's no issues of improprieties or nefarious actions or those type of things. So again, for officer-involved shootings, many times, if not most times, are investigated by outside agencies who will come in and do those investigations. Once that investigation has been completed by that third-party neutral outside agency, that package is all given to us, and then we as a professional services unit, the investigators will take that and will compile all the information and will do an investigation to make sure all of our policies and procedures and internal directives are being met, and making sure that we don't have training deficiencies or those type of things or policy or other issues that we need to incorporate. So once that critical incident investigation is completed, it comes to us for the internal affairs, which is commonly referred to an IA. So you may hear me say IA. Once an IA is generated, to look at internal processes and training and policies and procedures, that's when our real job kicks in. And a lot of people wonder, well, what is the process exactly? Talk to me about what an IA looks like. So kind of running from the beginning, let's say a complaint comes in from a citizen. The complaint comes in, it goes to the first line supervisor for preliminary investigations of the finding to find out what the merits of the complaints are, what's the subject of the complaint, and how serious of the nature of the complaint is. Once that first line supervisor takes care of the initial investigation, that's routed up through their supervisors through the chain of command for review. Eventually, that complaint depending on how it's handled, will come to our unit. Our commander will gather that information and then decides if an official, formal internal investigation with the 42 supervisory inquiries, those inquiries stop at that point. They don't go any further. The situation was resolved. There was some type of discipline, or it was unfounded or unsubstantiated at that point in time. So once it's determined that we are going to handle an internal affairs investigation, what goes into that investigation? What do we do? The first and foremost thing that we do is we collect everything up. Our position as investigators is purely a fact-finding mission. We do not offer any suggestions into the investigation. We have we find the facts and we present that to staff. So we're purely neutral parties when it comes to that. If it's from a case report or a situation in which a report was generated, we take all the information from the criminal case or the case file or everything else. We combine that. We take all the reports, the evidence, the statements, the complaints, the photographs, any evidence, and that's where we start our investigation from. So we take the work of what, say, a detective does, and we take that to the next level as far as internal investigation goes. We take everything and we look specifically into what the complaint is. So we have a huge pile of paperwork and documents and data. We take that down, we focus on what the complaint is, and that's where we start and we take our investigation. Again, we do not make any judgments for this. That's not our job. Our job is purely fact-finding. All the judgments and the disciplinary actions are all handled by the complaint review team and staff to decide what happens. That makes our job even more efficient and effective because, again, we're not making any type of judgments. We're simply putting the facts forward for the review team to make their decisions. Our job is to collect everything. We investigate and package the investigation into a complete package. And the best way I can put it this, and I kind of came up with this own thing by myself earlier today, but if you look at the Star Wars episodes, all, what, 7 or 9 of them, we're taking all those episodes, we're compacting it into one, and we're making it into one long movie. So that's kind of how we look at our internal affairs investigations. We conduct these investigations, myself, Investigator Reed, our other peers that work with us. I think we're very skilled interviewers. We conduct interviews with our officers. They're not interview and interrogation type officers. Oh, we were muted there for a sec. Sorry, I don't know what happened there. So again, when we interview officers, people ask, are officers afforded the same rights as everybody else? And we have this thing called our Garrity rights. Everybody else has their Miranda rights, which I think everybody's familiar with, but we in law enforcement have what we call Garrity. And why do we use it? Because we're employees, public employees, sorry. And we use that in situations that may have criminal allegations to them. And simply put, Garrity rights are there to protect public employees from being compelled to incriminate themselves during an investigator interview by their employers. Our employer is the government. So this all stems from the Fifth Amendment, which declares that the government cannot compel a person to be a witness against themselves. And so that's where Garrity comes in, because it's a unique situation being that we're governmental employees and we're interviewing ourselves. So again, Miranda doesn't apply, however, Garrity does. Again, for the public employee, the employer is the government itself. So we have to protect ourselves and extend the same rights as everybody else does. And that's why the Fifth Amendment applies to that interrogation if there's a potential criminal incident or conduct investigated. So once we gather that big pile of paperwork and we focus on the complaint that's at hand, we take that, we package it up, we've hopefully gathered all the facts and information we possibly can, and we forward that. And we forward that on to the complaint review team. And the complaint review team consists of a sergeant, a commander, and then 2 citizen review members from the citizens. They get all the information. They sit down, they review our entire investigation, everything that's contained in there, and then they make their own independent judgment as to the allegations set forth in the complaint. Once that complaint review team gets done, they then send their findings to the chief, the deputy chiefs, who then decide if there's going to be discipline or something else involved. The chiefs also look at policies and procedures and make sure that we're doing everything correctly. Again, we'll cover that here in a moment. So how many IAs are we doing per year? On average, over the last 4 years, we roughly average about 17 official internal affairs investigations each year. Over the last 4 years, we've had 68 internal affairs complaints. Of those internal affairs investigations, how many are sustained or founded? And again, this goes back to the accountability issue. And of those, 13 had some sort of discipline behind them, so that's roughly 20% of our internal affairs complaints have some type of findings that were sustained or founded. And again, looking back at these supervisory inquiries, 42 of those came through and 12 were founded. The bottom line is I think as a department, we're doing things the right way, but we do make mistakes. And again, we do hold ourselves accountable for those mistakes. And again, those things are helping us with training. Those are helping us with policies and procedures. Those help us come out and go to the community and find out how we can do things better. Those are all the things that we're looking for when we do these internal affairs investigations. So again, people want to know, well, what exactly was found to be inappropriate or there was misconduct? What situations were deemed to be founded or sustained? And we ask ourselves a series of questions that help us guide us to find out if there are issues. The first one is was there a department failure? Did we as a department or an agency do something wrong? Again, going back to the accountability, making sure we're doing things right, keeping up with the times, changing as things come up. That's the first thing. Was there a department failure? The second thing is, was there a training issue? Is there something we're missing in our yearly in-service training? Is there something we're missing in legal update? Is there something that we're doing training-wise that we can do better? Or are we seeing trends throughout the year that can help guide us do certain types of training? So again, these internal affairs investigations help us identify maybe some training deficiencies. Was there a policy or procedure issue? Are our policies and procedures being followed? Are they being adhered to? Are we operating out of those policies and procedures? Are we doing things that maybe should be considered policy and procedure that courts and other aspects have deemed common behavior? Things that maybe not are written, but things that we're doing on a continual basis that somebody says, well, even though it's not policy and procedure, it's a common practice. So again, we're looking at policy and procedure issues to make sure we're keeping up to date and updating those as the time changes. One of the things we look at is, was it reasonable? Can a reasonable person come into this situation, look at this complaint and say, yeah, that did not seem reasonable, or that was unreasonable? So again, the bottom line is, was it reasonable? And then lastly is, was it a violation of criminal law? If it was, maybe we bring in an outside agency if we have a criminal incident that we don't want to investigate. We don't want to put the issue out there that we're investigating ourselves, so we go to another agency in a situation where maybe criminal law was violated. And we have just another layer of an independent, neutral third party coming in and investigating a potential criminal act by one of our employees. It's impartiality, it's transparent, and then we put that forth and saying, look, we're not always investigating our own people. I think we do a good job, but there are times and there are circumstances and needs where we may go outside of the agency and have them investigate, whether that be an adjoining agency or something more than that. So again, that's kind of in a nutshell our internal affairs process, and hopefully y'all have some questions as we go on. And what does that lead into, which is our third topic? And our third topic is the disciplinary process. And with disciplinary processes, the bottom line is, are things fair? Is discipline meted out in a fair and non-judgmental process? Is discipline meted out in a progressive manner? In most cases, we believe in progressive discipline. Your first mistake, that's okay. Just like Wayne talked about in the hiring practices, the second, the third, fourth mistake, again, progressive discipline comes into play. It follows along the lines of our hiring. We don't look for perfect people when we hire, but we look for commonalities. Is there more than just one area of concern that we have? And again, so discipline can be progressive in most cases. When it comes to disciplinary issues, we have both positive and negative forms of discipline. And what is positive discipline? I heard this a number of years ago and I was like, what's positive discipline? Positive and negative discipline come in many forms. Positive discipline are clearly communicating behaviors that are appropriate. And then there's negative discipline is which of those behaviors are not appropriate. We try to really enforce behavior. Oh, okay. So again, we're looking for both positive and negative disciplinary issues. Again, result for good, consequences for bad, but it's not always necessarily punishment. I can tell you most of the officers in this agency, if they make a mistake, they're going to be the first ones to step up and say, I messed up on that, that's my bad. So that kind of makes it easier for supervisors. Other disciplinary processes, and again, we talk about positive and negative disciplinary. We have employee logbooks. Those are ongoing notations and measures of performance. So each employee within a department has an employee logbook. We used to call them blue books. And that's just a yearly documentation of both good and bad. If they go to a call and they get a compliment, boom, that goes into their blue book. If they get a complaint and it goes to a supervisor inquiry, that also goes into the blue book, so that the supervisors have a good idea when they do the yearly evaluations, which are part of the disciplinary process. It's on the positive side, but they have a good measure of their performance. They can see the notations, they can see patterns of history. We have our early warning systems that we have. Again, those are done in 6 months, and we look for patterns. Most of these situations are patterns of things that we may need to look out for in a department. How many use of force issues are these people doing? How many pursuits are they getting? Are they generating complaints? Are there sick days that they're taking? The early warning system works pretty effectively because we're doing bi-yearly evaluations of those. But again, those are for disciplinary, it's part of the disciplinary process. Things that we do as supervisors, at a minimum, and some units are different. My unit's probably a little different than most. We try to meet with our employees 2 to 3 times a year, and that's just sitting down, figuring out where they're at, where we're at. Is there anything you need? Are there any resources? Are there anything that we need or can provide to make your job better? And with that being said, there's a lot of community feedback in that, and that's where we look for communities on those biannual meetings, community members to give us some feedback. So again, the biannual meetings, early warning reports, we do our yearly evaluations. And within disciplinary, if there's something that happens, it can stem from a verbal counseling saying, hey, maybe next time you think about this, all the way running the gamut to if something's so egregious or out of the policies and procedures that it could end up in termination. So again, we have verbal counseling, we have written counseling, we have performance expectations that we're constantly evaluating and setting forth. We have remedial training as a form of disciplinary action. Somebody's just not doing the things that we need to, they're not picking up the training, so we send them through remedial training, making sure that they're getting all the training that they need. We can have a verbal to days off to a demotion. And again, these are all form of disciplinary issues that we go with. We have written letters of reprimands. And again, this can all go all the way into termination, which kind of goes into some things. But if somebody's going to get terminated, again, we go back to the rights of Garrity. Everybody has a pre-disciplinary hearing that they get. They're informed of what the disciplinary actions may come, and then ultimately the punishment comes out. And again, all that kind of relates back to the internal affairs investigations, the things that we investigate going through the process. So again, that may have been quick. I'm going to kind of put it up forward. Wayne, do you have anything that I may have missed?
No, I think that's good.
Okay.
We can take some questions.
Yeah, if so, we'll kind of leave it up to you, Luis, to see if anybody may have some questions.
Thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate it. Looks like we do not have any questions in queue right now. If anybody who's attending, you have any questions at all with regard to this topic or anything else, please type them in and we can go ahead and address those.
Hey, Luis, let's have the guys talk about what attributes we look for in a police officer.
One of the things, and I talked about this a couple weeks ago, and when I do classes with people present, which, you know, we're doing things a little different here, I try to get into a discussion with them, and I ask the community, which is who fills the classes, what is it that you want us to look for when we're hiring police officers? What that usually narrows down to, and I discussed it a couple weeks ago, is we have, I call it an umbrella. So we have umbrellas that have different characteristics under them. One of the two major umbrellas that we're usually looking for is integrity, is always the number one. And then under integrity, we have responsibility, accountability, and some of the things that Sergeant Trinket talked about. So to break it down into two big parameters, I would say integrity, number one, and then people skills on the other side. And I usually like to get into a discussion with the group about how do we find people with integrity? What tests do we use? What parameters do we use? What barometers do we use during the hiring process to determine if a person has integrity? And then I asked the class, should we be looking for that? And the answer for a police officer is always yes, because of some of the things that they have to do, some of the access that police officers have that most people don't. So with that access comes responsibility. With responsibility, that falls under integrity. The other thing we talk about a lot is people skills. 98% of our job is dealing with people. So we need people who can communicate with people. People who are different than them, people who are the same as them, people who have the flexibility to be able to communicate with just about anybody. So it boils down to integrity and people skills, I'd say, are the top two things that we're looking for when we're hiring somebody. Does anybody in the audience have any questions related to that, or the discipline process, or the internal affairs investigation process? Are there any questions at all at this point?
I'm not seeing any. Hey, Sergeant Trinka, could you talk a little bit about, you and I briefly touched on this earlier today, about kind of the process when someone applies, you know, how large of a process that is when we get candidates, everything they have to go through so that we ensure that we hire the best people.
So the process starts with us going out and recruiting, getting into the community, finding people, getting interest out there for law enforcement, in recruiting. It starts with recruiting, and that can start in the high schools, getting out to the high schools, getting out to the colleges and that type of thing, getting to the community colleges, finding kids, I call them kids, I apologize, but people in college who may have aspirations to be in law enforcement. So that's where it really starts. But once the actual meat and potatoes start of the application, it starts with the application. So people apply, that's the first step. And we ask questions. We ask integrity questions. We ask what's in your background, what's your history. We look for customer service type oriented people again, like Wayne said, who can communicate. And so the first step is the application process. Once we get those applications, that pool of applications, we screen those, and we look for things like customer service. We look for clean backgrounds. We look for things like not a lot of terminations or firings in their past history, criminal histories, and maybe substance abuse and those type of things will take people out of the process. So the first step is application. So once they submit their application, we review those. Once we get the applications done and we've screened those out, typically the next step for entry-level police officers is going to be a written test. And we used a cognitive-based written test to test people's overall cognitive ability. We put a lot of weight on somebody's past cognitive abilities. If they have that and they can pass the written test, it's a general reading, writing, arithmetic. Can they formulate sentences? Can they understand what they read? Can they follow certain maps and those type of things? So again, what are their critical? They test some critical thinking skills and those type of things. So that's what our second stage of the test is. And then once they pass the written test, those who pass, then we move on to a phone interview, which is more of a, is there anything in your background? Why are you looking at the city of Westminster to be a part of? And then tell us a little bit about your background. Where have you worked? What's your experience? What's your life experience? From there, we go into an actual, what we call oral boards, which is a 30-minute chance for you to present yourself. Again, some of our questions that we ask, again, why you prepare, or what have you done to prepare for a police officer? We again go into the critical thinking area. How do you act under certain circumstances? What are your thoughts on certain questions? How do you handle conflict resolution? Throw out some integrity questions. How do you think through certain questions where we pose maybe an integrity question to you? So that's a 30-minute oral board. And I think at that point we've done a pretty good screening. We've gotten to know the candidates. A lot of it's self-reporting. If they pass the oral boards, then we move them on to a background investigation. The background investigation takes about anywhere from 5 to 6 weeks, and that includes going from your background from all the way back when you were a kid to where you're at now, looking at your histories, your work, your college, your schooling, all that stuff, family members, everything. And so we really dig deep into somebody's background and try to get to know who this person is. Within the backgrounds, we do job suitability evaluations. People call them the psych test, but they're job suitability evaluations. We do either polygraphs or CVSA's, computer voice stress analysis. Again, it's an integrity measure that we check. And then we go through the background process, and there's really no stones that aren't unturned in somebody's background, because we really want to get to know these people. It's a two-way street in that aspect. They get to know us and we get to know them. Of the people that pass the background portion of that, we have the next phase in which we present all of our backgrounds to staff, and then we give staff a presentation on the applicants, and staff fully expects us to know these people, not just what's on paper, but as a human being and how they'll be as a police officer and those type of things. We look for a collective basis, a kind of a predictability aspect of how we think somebody will be as a police officer. We present that to staff, and then they ultimately make, upon our recommendations, they make the final judgment. The person's then sent into a post-psychological test. This is a true psych, which is a medically evaluated test. And we also run them through a drug screen and physical to make sure that they're physically capable and can do the job. And then once that does, then we send out final offers. That process from beginning to end, from application process to final offers, is usually about 6 months. So that's kind of what goes into hiring.
Thank you very much. Very detailed. I appreciate it, Sarge.
I don't see any other questions from our attendees, Sergeant Officer Reed. If you could talk to us about what types of discipline can an officer receive, and can they actually be fired for their behaviors?
So discipline comes in many forms, as I kind of briefly touched on that. Discipline can again, we talk about positive and negative. Discipline can come from maybe just a verbal warning, depending on what those actions were. And that can go to a written warning, to maybe some remedial training, to a letter of reprimand, to days off, to demotion, all the way up to termination, or to termination, depending on what the allegations and the conduct of the employee are. So I guess as human beings, as many mistakes as we can come up with, we deal with those. And so discipline comes in just absolutely many forms, and a lot of it just depends on how bad the violation is. I mean, obviously, violations of criminal law are not taken lightly, and most of the time those will result in some type of termination. We all have bad days. We all make mistakes. Again, the idea is not to pound somebody for a simple mistake, because we all make those mistakes, but making sure that these people are learning. It's no different than us going out and doing traffic enforcement. Traffic enforcement doesn't always mean giving a ticket. Sometimes that means educating the public as to, hey, you were doing this wrong, and the traffic violator understands that, and maybe that's as far as that contact goes. Even though they ran a red light or they were speeding, maybe a verbal warning might be in play. That goes the same for police work for the most part, and how we dole out discipline, if that makes sense. Did that answer your question, Sherry?
Yes, thank you. And I don't see any other questions from our attendees. So kind of to wrap this up, we've been talking about discipline and internal affairs and all of that kind of stuff. So who can people call if they have a compliment for an officer?
So they can call in internal affairs, and every one of our business cards that the officers go out, by law, they're required on most contacts, the traffic stop, those type of things, to give out business cards if there's no official action taken. So they can reach the professional services unit. They can contact dispatch. They can contact the watch commander. They can walk in. They can send us emails. They can connect with us through Facebook or any type of social media platforms that are out there. There's a myriad of ways people can give us compliments and or complaints, and we do get a lot of compliments, and those are fantastic. So there's many ways to communicate with the police department to provide that feedback from the community that we're looking for.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions from any of our attendees. Luis, I think we can wrap this up and call it a night.
Yes, I agree. Again, everybody who did attend, we're so grateful, and hopefully you will join us on our next presentation. That'll be in a couple of weeks, and we will be sending something out. Sergeant Tranka, Investigator Reed, thank you very much for the informative presentation this evening.
And thank you to all those who attended.
Thanks. Have a good night, everyone.